Welcome to Breakpoint this week. I'm here with John Stonestreet to talk about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. I'm Shane Morris. John, for a while I was, starting to complain that everything we had to talk about on this show this year was COVID-19. It was COVID-19 all the time, wall to wall. And that's still a major story, but man, have the headlines been just crammed with other stuff lately. The big story this week, I think, that we need to start out with talking about is the Supreme Court's decision in Bostock versus Clayton County.
Yeah, and look, this is as big of a ground shift or as big of a decision as Obergefell was. It really is. Obergefell made this one probably inevitable. This ruling in which the Civil Rights Act, at least Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, being expanded the way that Neil Gorsuch and the majority of the court did, to include sexual orientation and gender identity. I mean, this is inevitable, but it's going to open up a whole new world of possibilities, particularly when it comes to the rest of the acts in the civil, or the rest of the titles, in the Civil Rights Act.
Right. So for those who don't know, what happened was in a 6-3 vote, the Supreme Court ruled that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which was passed all the way back in 1964, and prohibited discrimination in employment on the basis of sex and race and so forth, also includes sexual orientation and gender identity. So this is just an earth-shattering decision, and it's not being treated as such because it's so technical. It's not like gay marriage is legal like it was in Obergefell. This is something that's a technical shift. But what it does is inserts SOGI categories, sexual orientation, gender identity, into the Civil Rights Act, which effectively does what liberal legislators have been trying to do in Congress for over a decade now.
Right, through the Equality Act. In fact, on Thursday, Nancy Pelosi actually tried to run through the Equality Act through the legislature, and it failed.
We might as well just pass it now.
Well, I'm not even sure it's necessary. I mean,
Right.
The question is going to be based on this argument, which Neil Gorsuch made, which we need to get into. It's going to be impossible now to, think about all the areas of life and culture that the Civil Rights Act touched. And essentially it was an attempt to say, that you couldn't keep African Americans out of any part of American life and society. They had to have the same access. They had to be able to have the same experience and employment and education and so on. I think the next domino to fall, in fact, this will come out in a commentary, Breakpoint commentary early next week. I think the next domino to fall will be Title IX, and that affects education, specifically sex-specific opportunities, including team sports, facilities, and things like that. And we've already seen people try to get at Title IX on a number of levels to expand the definition of sex in the language of Title IX to include SOGI categories. But there's going to be no way really logically, and I'm not saying, by the way, Neil Gorsuch's opinion was logical, but based on what he has now established, there's no way logically to keep it out of Title IX or the rest.
I don't know if this is too mean, but I think that Justice Scalia might have called it jiggery-pokery, which is the phrase he used to describe the legal reasoning in Obergefell. But, Samuel Alito's, Associate Justice Samuel Alito's dissent was really just an amazing piece of, legal criticism. And he lists all the different areas of law that are going to be inevitably affected by the logic that Justice Gorsuch used in this case. He says that it's going to have knock-on effects on bathrooms and schools and women's sports and housing and employment by religious organizations and healthcare and even freedom of speech. And the reason for that is simple, John. It's that in law, we have now introduced an argument that equates SOGI categories with race, and we don't tolerate discrimination on the basis of race or sex. But once we have equated these two things, these three categories rather, the dominoes are going to fall. Like you said, there is no sound legal basis to hold those dominoes back.
There's not. There's not. And he did it in a strange sort of way. And this is why some of us, had nightmares of, Justice Kennedy way of arguing these things. Justice Kennedy got what he wanted in the law. And I'm not saying it's a bad motivation. I mean, I think he was wrong in how he argued Obergefell. and even what he said in earlier laws about, the right to pursue one's own sense of meaning and all kinds of things that he put in previous decisions.
Life
In other words, he got to where he wanted by completely making stuff up, right? I mean, Kennedy just invented things out of thin air, things that had nothing to do with the Constitution. In fact, you might remember John Roberts responded to Justice Kennedy's decision in Obergefell by saying, look, if you wanted same-sex marriage today, then you should celebrate, but don't celebrate the Constitution, because this had nothing to do with the Constitution, right? Now, in a strange sort of way, what we had Justice Gorsuch doing is getting to where he wanted to get to, not by making things out of thin air, but by making words mean something else. So everyone kind of expected this whole thing to hinge on whether he would say the meaning of the word sex should now mean sexual orientation and gender identity. And the opposite side of that, everyone thought, was, no, the question is, what did they mean in 1964 by the word sex? So what he did,
he tried to go at it without redefining.
Oh, it was a rhetorical jujitsu of the highest order, and I think if this is now the new Kennedy, it's a different approach than Kennedy, but it's the same kind of playing around with the law. So essentially, what he tried to do is say, no, of course, in 1964, sexual orientation and gender identity are not the same things as sex. Homosexuality, transgender status are distinct concepts. That's what he actually argued. But then here's what he did. He said, but you can't discriminate against homosexuals or those who are transgender without first discriminating on the basis of sex. So if you would have no problem with a female employee having sex with a man, then you shouldn't have any problem with a male employee having sex with a man. If a female employee can dress in blouses and skirts and high heels and pantyhose, then it's a discrimination against their sex to say that a man can't do the same thing. So it was a rhetorical jujitsu of really an incredible order. The other thing too, Shane, that we need to say, and that's huge, is that there was something that was done, and we had a conversation this week with the defense attorney for Harris Funeral Homes, who was one of the defendants in this case. There were 3 cases that were basically squished together, 2 having to do with employees that were gay, 1 having to do with an employee that was transgender.
We got the SOGI categories all smashed together in one case. Right.
And look, you and I have talked about this before. The L and the G and the T aren't saying the same things, right? I mean, they disagree fundamentally on almost on a whole lot of things. And I think, look, somebody at some point's got to call out the T activists for essentially hijacking movements they had nothing to do with and riding the coattails to victory. And that certainly is the case here, because the question of what happened to the plaintiff, the employee of Harris Funeral Home, is a far different question than what happened in terms of these other cases. In fact, what's been revealed is the plaintiff, who the case is named after, right? Bostock or Bostock. What's fascinating about this case is it's becoming clear that he actually wasn't fired because he was gay. His employer knew he was gay. And that was an article that was written this week in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, which is a stunning thing, that basically he actually wasn't wronged on this basis, but his name now will go down in history as advancing this in employee rights.
Yeah. And to be clear, John, I would say that in many cases, if I were in the position of running a business, I would say that I would be very open to the idea of a self-professed gay employee, doing work that doesn't directly relate to sexuality. And I understand that many people would probably have a different idea on that. I think what's really dangerous here is the equation that's being made between sexual orientation, gender identity, and race. Because that's going to have further implications well beyond what well beyond employment that doesn't have to do with sex. So,
well, not just employment, right? So, I mean, what this is going to mean when this precedent is used to force these categories into Title IX is, then a college can't keep a biologically male athlete off a women's sports team. And they cannot keep a biological male out of women's locker rooms or dormitories if they want to have access to things like federal funds. I think I think what we're going to see, the court, for the record, has still done plenty to protect religious liberty. Okay, the court has also done plenty to protect the religious freedom of religious institutions in particular. So I think where this leads us is we're going to end up with some sort of Utah compromise-ish sort of thing, where religious institutions are protected, but immediately seen as bigots and biases, and so, biased up front. So
Right.
in other words, we're the new KKK. If you ask me, what's the number one thing this is going to change? This is going to, we've been talking about this, right? If you put civil rights and LGBT rights as equal, then that means people who are opposed to them are also equal.
Mm.
And we've warned that this is where this is going to take. I think this is the outcome. The outcome is now anyone opposed to this revisionist new form of sexual morality will likely be considered social pariahs up front.
We're going to take a quick break. We'll talk more about this when we come back on Breakpoint this week. Stay with us. We're back on Breakpoint this week, talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. I'm Shane Morris here with John Stonestreet. John, Josh Hawley, senator from Missouri, gave, I think, one of the most powerful, just dissections of this decision and the implications for Christians and the conservative legal movement more broadly. And it was just a stunning speech. And he called this decision, Bostock, the end of the conservative legal movement as we know it. And I just want to read an excerpt here from his speech because it was just so powerful. He said, "The bargain has never been explicitly articulated, but religious conservatives know what it is. The bargain is that you go along with the party establishment, you support their policies and priorities, or at least keep your mouth shut about it. And in return, the establishment will put some judges on the bench who supposedly will protect your constitutional rights to freedom of worship, to freedom of exercise." How has that worked out for us? And I think it's a very powerful question, especially in light of the fact that Neil Gorsuch is a Republican appointee, and not just a Republican appointee, but one who was used in a very central way to justify voting for Donald Trump, who is who's a morally problematic figure.
Well, look, I mean, so it brings up two questions. And first of all, I thought Hawley's speech was surgical. I thought it was fantastic. And I thought the most powerful parts about it were not necessarily questioning this, but two other things. First is articulating that social conservatism and kind of political conservatism aren't the same things. And they haven't been the same things for quite some time. And there's strange bedfellows within the Republican Party that make it very difficult to always be consistent in your views. And I think the need to birth a new one. I think Roger Eyre made that claim that this was going to go down in history as the day it all started. And I don't know, if that's the case, but it was a powerful speech. The other thing that I thought was really great, it was that here you have the legislative branch at least speaking out against the judicial branch in this sort of strong way. I got an email this week, and just somebody really discouraged, saying, look, why do these rogue judges get to determine everything? And of course, we've been saying that for years, and primarily when we thought we had a leftist sort of court. I think what we have is as a politically right sort of court, but a socially left sort of court, right? I mean, John Roberts has demonstrated that he's not willing to die on the hill of social conservatism, and apparently Neil Gorsuch isn't either. And I tweeted this week, I supported Gorsuch and I was wrong, Now, it does bring up two questions that I also tweeted this as a poll, and that's how you come to truth, is you do a Twitter poll. That'll make it all better. But it's like, well, what does this mean? Does this mean it would have been far worse if we were dealing with President Clinton, and not only in the Supreme Court nominees, but certainly all the way down the line across regions, regional courts, district courts, state courts, and all of that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. That's fair to say.
It's a fair question, and would it have been worse? And then the second thing, or is the case that we have put far too much weight into what the president can do to change things? Because if you look at what Neil Gorsuch did in his opinion, and you look at how, and you contrast that with Justice Alito's dissent, and by the way, even Justice Kavanaugh's dissent, I don't think that has gotten quite the read that it should have. It was he called out some really, really important things in the methodology that Gorsuch used, and I think that are worth looking at. But have we put too much weight in the court to kind of advance this? If there's one thing that Gorsuch's opinion proves to me, it's that the law is downstream from culture. I mean, this would, as one of my friends, Brian Mattson, put on Twitter this week, culture is driving this train. And I think law is part of culture. I think sometimes law leads culture. I was just having this conversation yesterday. I mean, like how it's a culturally normal thing to buckle your seatbelt. And that's like 10 years old. It was not like that yesterday. And the thing that changed it was the law and a whole lot of, political ad campaigns. But when you talk about something like what we're dealing with, the culture's way out ahead on this one. And I think that's what, Josh Hawley was really calling us to. And I think it's a legitimate thing. At least we can say maybe it would have been far worse under President Clinton. And I would say that specifically across the board and the administrative part of the state.
Yeah.
But I do think we need the branches of government are supposed to keep each other accountable. And thank Josh Hawley for being a legislator, calling out the judiciary, saying this isn't your job to legislate from the bench. And this is what exactly it happened with Gorsuch's opinion.
Well, as Russell Moore of the Southern Baptist Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission said earlier this week, if this philosophy holds across decisions in the future, what it means is essentially that legislators have no idea what they're enacting when they vote for a new law, because the meaning of words can change at any point in the future. This is another chapter in the judicial tyranny that conservatives have been complaining about for ages. But what makes it particularly a bitter chapter, John, is that this is an ostensibly conservative appointee. This was someone who was supposed to rule in a way that was originalist or textualist or whatever buzzword you want to use. And we still have the law being redefined and updated from the court here. So I think one of Hawley's best points was that we can't look to the court to save us culturally. It's not going to happen. The court keeps handing, whether it's the Supreme Court or the federal judiciary as a whole, keep handing the progressive left cultural victories here. So
and can I say something here, Shane? Because
sure.
Yeah, I mean, let me say something here about the originalism and textualism, because a lot has been made about that when it comes to Gorsuch's opinion. He tried to do the textualist thing. He tried to do an originalist thing. And I think that maybe reveals one of the problems, right? Textualism is a necessary but not a sufficient ingredient in and of itself to give you judicial conservatism, right? I mean, yes, you need to be a textualist. You need to say, hey, the meaning of words matter, but then you need to have a frame of reference that is able to define words according to common sense, according to reality. And it was this, I think we've talked so much when it comes to the difference between conservative judges and liberal judges that the whole thing boils down to, well, what do the words mean? And this is actually what Kavanaugh's dissent actually brought out, is that a real conservatism doesn't do this kind of textual literalism. It does a common sense reading of the text and takes the text seriously from the common usage, not this kind of strict literal usage. I mean, there was some parsing that Gorsuch did in his opinion that was, I mean, at one level you're like, well, that's impressive, man. I didn't expect that. But what you're bringing out here is just the exact opposite of what the civil rights intended. Right. So the authorial intent was nowhere to be found in his opinion.
Yeah. As Alito said, if you'd taken a poll in the mid 1960s of all Americans, which is, the common understanding of these concepts is what we try to articulate in law. And if you'd taken a poll of Americans in, 64, 65, as to whether sex includes sexual orientation, being gay, lesbian, or your gender identity, most of them probably would have said, no, it doesn't mean being gay. And then they would have, for the gender identity, they would have said, huh? What's that?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, listen, 2009, when Chuck Colson and Timothy George and Robbie George put together the Manhattan Declaration, that was 2009.
Yeah.
And the transgender moment was nowhere in anyone's purview at that point. Like no one was thinking, I mean, you knew people who dressed across genders, but the idea that then we would say something like biological sex is a social construct, or, I mean, what was the child psychology professor at Duke University during the Prop 108 who said that genitalia, chromosomes, hormones, and reproductive organs are not reliable scientific means of determining sex or gender. And you hear that and you think, what else do you say? I mean, we have untethered from reality itself.
So in light of this untethering from reality, the question that we have to deal with as Christians is what's next? So we have, a debate going on right now about what the future looks like politically and judicially. How do we move forward? How do we construct a sort of conservative philosophy of the Constitution and judges who will uphold that philosophy? But then on the other hand, John, we like to emphasize at the Colson Center here that cultural work is, if anything, more important than the political work. And that the stuff that's upstream from what happens in politics, because all of this stuff is led by culture. So we had this really interesting article. I want to take a quick break here. We're going to talk about this article by Kevin DeYoung at the Gospel Coalition after we come back. Stay with us. We're back on Breakpoint this week talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. And John, I wanted to lead this segment with just an interesting article by Kevin DeYoung, a pastor writing at the Gospel Coalition. He says it's time for a new culture war strategy. And the strategy is have more children and disciple them like crazy. And here's a passage from what he says. Do you want to rebel against the status quo? And he's saying all this in light of the Supreme Court decision. Do you want people to ask you for a reason for the hope that's in you? Citing 1 Peter 3:15. Then tote your brood of children through Target. There is almost nothing more countercultural than having more children. And once we have those children, there's almost nothing more important than catechizing them in the faith, developing their moral framework, and preparing them to be deeply compassionate lovers of God and lovers of people and relentlessly biblical lovers of truth. And to that, I say amen. But to that, many Twitter users did not say amen.
No, they didn't. Before we get there, let me just say that, the fact that this is controversial says a whole lot more about the church than about anything that Kevin DeYoung, said or wrote. So during our Truth Love Together event, Andy Crouch did a wonderful talk about the patient ferment of the early church, which is a book title, which I love. I keep going back and thinking about that. But one of the things he said is that the early church, you can't find, this kind of structured teaching around evangelism, right? But you do find it around patience, because that was so countercultural. Now, we could say that evangelism wasn't important in the early church, but I think that's probably not true at all, right? I think it was very important. But the point probably
Most
was
of the New
more,
Testament is written by this guy named Paul, who was pretty good at evangelism.
Yeah, he did it sometimes. So, but my point is that this, to say that you had to do something, I think the early church would say, of course we're telling everybody about this, because it, this whole you preach the gospel and when necessary use words. It would be like, no, what are you talking about? This is a message that Jesus is the Messiah to all the Jews and that Jesus is king to all the Romans, right? I mean, there's a message to proclaim, and it was the identifying, defining mark of their movement. I think the same thing when I see this, that the reaction on Twitter that this is somehow controversial,
or idolizing the family, or neglecting the gospel.
Well, let's get into the specifics here in just a second, because that's when it gets even more bizarre. But just the fact that you'd have to say this, I think, in generations past, this is what we missed. That until yesterday, you wouldn't have to teach this, because this is observable. What you should do is get married, have some babies, and raise them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And this is one of the ways that the kingdom goes forward. And in fact, even more, ways the kingdom goes forward. And this isn't a slam against single people. It wouldn't have been seen as a slam. It would just been observable, obvious, taken for granted truth.
Right.
But leave it to Twitter to disagree with that.
It sounds like something Martin Luther would say. He was one of the most pro-family writers in the history of the church, and actually kicked against some of the anti-family biases of his time. And yet the criticism DeYoung received here from, I guess, a more left-leaning Christian set of Twitter was just, criticism like what we just talked about, that this is idolizing the family, putting it ahead of the gospel, that it's not considerate of couples who are infertile or single people, who can't have kids. And it doesn't, one even said it didn't mention adoption or something. I don't know that many of these critics actually even read the piece, because he explicitly says, I'm not saying anything about single people. I'm not saying anything about those who are infertile. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about those who have the ability as Christian couples to maybe have an extra kid, maybe have 2 extra kids, to stretch themselves, to go beyond the cultural expectations and really invest in the future by affirming the goodness of life and family and discipleship of the little children, bringing them to Jesus, as he said to the disciples. That shouldn't be controversial, but for some reason it is now.
Well, the argument is that that first of all, not everyone is married or can be married, and not everyone can have children.
And we can talk about other issues related to that, because the marriage rate in this country is abysmally low right now, and that's a cultural phenomenon in and of itself.
Right. I mean, but if you look at, okay, what's the thing causing more trouble right now for the Christian witness? Is it the fact that the church emphasizes healthy marriages and healthy parents too much? This reminds me of one time I was speaking, and someone about how Christian teenagers needed to know why they believe what they believe and be able to understand other worldviews and defend their faith before they go to college. And somebody in the audience said, I think the problem is that youth groups have been too intellectual. And I was like, man, please take me to that youth group, because I have never seen that youth group ever. And here's the same thing. It's like, really, what has caused more damage? Has it been that the church idolizes marriage and family, or that the church has completely embraced no-fault divorce and is too scared to say anything about it, or the church has completely embraced contraception without any sort of kind of even moral conversation ahead of time about this, not to mention abortifacient contraception, which actually ends a human life, or the idea that there is no inherent connection between marriage and children, or that the church has really embraced this idea that marriage is about companionship and personal happiness. And so that should determine if and when and how you have children. And if you choose an intentionally, now let me note this carefully, an intentionally childless marriage, then that's completely okay. And, the church fathers and scripture and theology and God had nothing to say. I mean, what's more of a problem, that we emphasize this, or that too many, husbands and fathers are addicted to porn? In other words, are we really responding to the challenge of the sexual revolution that well, that you can say we've elevated and are idolizing family, marriage and family? Or are we just, at the altar of Molech here, barely hanging on, and we're accused of being too, I want to be more patient, because I do know that there are a lot of 20-something young women in particular who want to be married, and they want to have children, and they feel left out when you hear articles like this, because they are trying. And so I want to acknowledge that. But their desire to be married and have children and not being able to get there is not the fault of a church that idolizes marriage. It's the fault of a culture that turns young men into adolescents. That's the real problem.
And if we don't figure this out, John, if we don't understand how to return to a central vision of the family, of fertility, of the goodness of children, and of investing in the future through bringing the next generation into existence and prioritizing that, then all the Supreme Court justices in the world that are, strict textualists are not going to redeem this culture. We actually have to participate ourselves by bringing this next generation into existence and discipling them. And none of that is any sort of knock on, going out and converting our neighbors who are not Christians, who are adults or whatever. None of that is a knock on that. It's an acknowledgement of the fact that we're only going to live for so many decades. At the end of that, what are we going to leave behind for this world? Is there going to be...
Yeah, look, the only thing I disagree with, and I don't disagree, the only thing I would correct on Kevin DeYoung's piece, which I thought was really good, and we'll link to it at breakpoint.org, is he called this a strategy. This is like calling gravity a strategy, right? In other words, let's use gravity to our advantage. It's not really a strategy. It's just part, and I know what he was trying to do. He was trying to go back to the basics, like, and like Roger Ayers saying, look, before we go out there and try to fight a culture war, we might want to actually raise some culture warriors. We might actually want to. And so I'm not quibbling with it at all. It's just, but I think we need to start talking about this stuff as if it's gravity, not as if it's a strategy. It's not like, hey, we haven't tried having kids in a while, let's try it. It's, let's raise a new generation of people who can engage the brokenness of our culture by embracing what is true about life in the world, including marriage. And now that we've got a legal opposition that has such strong headwinds, this is after years of a cultural opposition with strong headwinds. We got to go back to basics. And I'm kind of gutted here that, we're out of time to talk about one guy who's brought a really cool strategy around this reality to the issue of fatherlessness. If you come to our
have a
podcast,
Breakpoint
we're going to talk
commentary
about
about this week. Yeah. So
well, we are. And let's talk about it here on the podcast edition too.
Well, that wraps it up for today. Folks, be sure and check out breakpoint.org for links to all the stories we've mentioned on today's program. You'll also find new material every day to help you think and live Christianly. And we're really glad that you're listening to the program. For the Colson Center and for John Stonestreet, I'm Shane Morris. We'll see you next time.